Sometimes losing everything teaches you what truly matters. Margaret Hale learned that lesson when her husband died in a stampede, leaving her alone to raise their daughter and run the Circle H ranch. She'd built walls around her heart and her land, and she wasn't about to let some ex-convict tear them down. When Eli Brand showed up asking for work, she met him with a shotgun. "I don't hire outlaws." But that same day, when her daughter Clara fell into the rushing creek, it was Eli who jumped in without thinking. He pulled the girl from the water and held her close while she caught her breath. In that moment, Margaret saw past his scars to the man beneath. But would one act of courage be enough to heal 6 years of pain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the rescue dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of light that made the Colorado mountains look like God's own painting. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the stranger tend to her horses, with movements that spoke of years in the saddle. Eli Brand worked quietly, his scarred hands gentle as he checked each animal's hooves and brushed their coats. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, respectful, as if he understood that earning trust took time. Margaret's fingers found the worn gold band on her left hand, twisting it as she'd done countless times over the past 10 years. Henry's ring, she'd never removed it, not even when the loneliness felt like it might swallow her whole. The simple band had become both comfort and shield, a reminder of love lost and a barrier against love found. "Mama, is the man staying for breakfast?" Clara's voice carried the hopeful note of a 12-year-old who'd spent too many mornings with just her mother for company. "I don't know, sweetheart." Margaret turned from the window, studying her daughter's face. Clara had her father's eyes warm brown with flecks of gold that caught the light when she smiled. This morning, those eyes held something Margaret hadn't seen in years, genuine excitement about a stranger's presence. "He saved my life," Clara said simply, settling at the kitchen table where Henry's leather journal lay open beside Margaret's coffee cup. The thick book contained 10 years of ranch records, weather notes, and private thoughts that Henry had shared with no one. After his death, Margaret had continued the tradition, filling pages with her own observations and fears. "I know he did, Clara, and I'm grateful." Margaret poured milk into a glass, her movements careful and measured. But gratitude doesn't mean we throw caution to the wind. Through the window, she watched Eli lead the horses to pasture. He'd slept in the barn last night, despite her offer of the bunkhouse. Pride, she supposed, or maybe just the wariness of a man who'd learned not to expect kindness. Either way, it spoke to a character that understood boundaries. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the main road. Jake Morrison and Tom Wheeler, her two regular hands, rode up the dusty path with the easy confidence of men who'd worked the same land for years. Both were good men, Jake, with his steady temperament, and Tom with his quick smile, but neither had the quiet strength she'd observed in Eli Brand. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," Jake called out, tipping his hat as he dismounted. His eyes found Eli immediately, and Margaret saw the subtle tension that entered his shoulders. News traveled fast in small communities, and she knew both men had heard about their unexpected guest. "Morning, Jake, Tom." Margaret stepped onto the porch, Clara close behind her. "I trust you both slept well?" "Well enough," Tom replied, though his gaze remained fixed on Eli. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday. Creek's been running high since the storm." "Clara's fine," Margaret said firmly, "thanks to Mr. Brand's quick thinking." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but folks in town are talking. Word is he's fresh out of Yuma. 6 years for killing a man." "Jake." Margaret's voice carried a warning, but he pressed on. "I'm just saying maybe we should be careful. You've got Clara to think about." Before Margaret could respond, Eli appeared around the corner of the barn, leading her prize stallion, Thunder. The big black horse had been skittish around strangers since Henry's death, but he followed Eli with the calm trust of an old friend. "Impressive," Tom murmured, and Margaret found herself nodding. Henry had spent months training Thunder, and the horse had never taken to anyone else so quickly. Eli approached the group with measured steps, his hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to take in everything without appearing to stare. "Morning," he said simply, nodding to the assembled group. "Mr. Brand," Margaret acknowledged. "I believe you've met Jake and Tom." "We've heard about you," Jake said, his tone carefully neutral. "I expect you have." Eli's voice carried no defensiveness, just the quiet acceptance of a man who'd learned to live with judgment. "I'll be moving on today. Just wanted to make sure the horses were settled first." "Moving on?" Clara's voice was small, disappointed. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. "There's no need to rush off, Mr. Brand. You're welcome to stay for breakfast at least." "That's kind of you, ma'am, but I don't want to cause trouble." "You saved my daughter's life," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. "The least I can do is feed you a proper meal." Jake and Tom exchanged glances, but said nothing. They'd worked for Margaret long enough to recognize that tone, the one that brooked no argument. "Besides," Margaret continued, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about needing work." Eli's eyes sharpened slightly. "Yes, ma'am?" "Ranch this size needs steady hands. Good hands. And Clara's right, you did save her life. That means something." "Mama," Clara whispered, tugging at Margaret's sleeve. "Does this mean he can stay?" Margaret looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at Eli's carefully neutral expression. Something in his eyes reminded her of Henry, not in appearance, but in the quiet strength that came from facing hard truths and continuing to stand. "We'll discuss terms over breakfast," she said finally. "If you're interested." "Yes, ma'am, I'm interested." As the group moved toward the house, Margaret caught Jake's concerned look. She understood his worry, she shared it. But she also remembered the way Eli had jumped into that creek without hesitation, the way he'd held Clara while she coughed up water, the gentleness in his scarred hands as he'd checked her for injuries. The kitchen filled with the comfortable sounds of a working ranch boots on wooden floors, chairs scraping against wood, the soft murmur of men discussing the day's work. Margaret prepared breakfast while listening to the conversation, noting how Eli answered questions directly but offered little additional information. "Been working cattle long?" Tom asked, accepting a cup of coffee. "Most of my life," Eli replied. "Before," he paused, then continued. "Before I went away, I worked ranches throughout Colorado and Wyoming." "What happened?" Jake's question hung in the air like smoke. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I killed a man who was trying to hurt people I cared about. The law saw it different than I did." The honesty was stark, unvarnished. Margaret found herself respecting him for it. "That's all you're going to say?" Jake pressed. "That's all that matters," Eli said simply. "I served my time. I'm looking for a chance to start over." Clara, who had been quietly eating her eggs, suddenly spoke up. "My daddy always said a man should be judged by what he does, not what people say about him." The wisdom in her 12-year-old voice surprised everyone. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, remembering Henry's gentle philosophy and seeing it reflected in their daughter. "Your daddy was a wise man," Eli said softly, and Margaret heard something in his voice that made her think he'd known good men like Henry once. After breakfast, as Jake and Tom headed out to check the fence lines, Margaret found herself alone with Eli on the porch. Clara had gone to feed the chickens, leaving them in the comfortable silence of two adults who'd shared an unspoken understanding. "The bunkhouse is clean," Margaret said finally. "Has been since we lost our last hand in the spring." "I appreciate that, ma'am, but I should mention I don't have much by way of wages. Lost most everything before." "Before you went to prison," Margaret finished. "Mr. Brand, I'm not hiring you out of charity. This ranch needs someone who understands cattle and isn't afraid of hard work. From what I've seen, you're both." Eli nodded slowly. "What are the terms?" "Room and board, plus $30 a month. You'll work with Jake and Tom, but you'll answer to me." "And Mr. Brand?" Margaret's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd learned to run a ranch alone. "I have one rule that's not negotiable. Clara's safety comes first. Always." "Understood, ma'am. Wouldn't expect anything less." As Eli walked toward the bunkhouse to settle his few belongings, Margaret opened Henry's journal to a fresh page. She wrote the date carefully, then paused, pen hovering over the paper. Hired new hand today, Eli Brand. Clara likes him, and he saved her life. Time will tell if I've made the right choice. Henry always said, trust your instincts, but mine have been quiet so long, I'm not sure I remember how to listen. She closed the journal and twisted her wedding ring again, watching through the window as Eli emerged from the bunkhouse and headed toward the barn. He moved with purpose, already studying the ranch with the eye of someone who understood that every detail mattered. Clara appeared at her side, slipping her small hand into Margaret's larger one. I like him, Mama. He has kind eyes. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, remembering Henry's words about judging a man by his actions. Eli Brand had jumped into a rushing creek to save a child he didn't know. Whatever else he might be, he was a man who acted when it mattered. We'll see, sweetheart, Margaret said. We'll see. 3 weeks settled into rhythm at the Circle H Ranch, like water finding its natural course. Eli proved himself with quiet competence, rising before dawn to check the cattle and staying late to mend fence lines that had needed attention for months. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. A broken gate repaired without being asked. A sick calf nursed back to health, the water pump fixed with parts he'd fashioned himself. Margaret found herself watching him work, noting the careful way he handled every task. There was something almost reverent in how he treated the land and animals, as if he understood their trust was a gift not to be taken lightly. Clara had taken to following him around when her chores were finished, chattering about everything and nothing, while Eli listened with the patient attention of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. It was on a Wednesday evening, with the sun painting the mountains gold, that Eli finally shared his story. They sat on the porch after supper, Margaret in Henry's old rocker, Clara at her feet, working on her arithmetic, and Eli on the steps, his hat in his hands. The man I killed, he began without preamble, his voice steady but distant. His name was Wade Hutchins. He and his boys were claimed jumpers, running a widow and her 3 children off land that was rightfully theirs. Margaret set down her mending, sensing this story had been weighing on him. Martha Connolly had proof of ownership, but Hutchins didn't care about legal papers, said a woman had no business running a claim. When she refused to leave, he started burning her crops, killing her livestock, making it clear she wasn't safe. Clara looked up from her slate, her young face serious. Margaret wanted to send her inside, but something told her this story needed witnessing. I was passing through, heard about the trouble from the sheriff. He was a good man but old, and Hutchins had 6 men with him. Sheriff asked if I'd help escort the widow to the territorial courthouse in Denver. Legal proceedings, all proper and above board. Eli's scarred hands worked the brim of his hat, and Margaret noticed how his knuckles bore the marks of old fights. We never made it to Denver. Hutchins and his boys caught up with us at a way station, said they'd come to collect what was theirs. When Martha showed them the legal papers, Hutchins lit them on fire right in front of her children. The evening air grew still, as if the land itself was listening. That's when the shooting started. Hutchins went for his gun when Martha tried to stop the papers from burning. I was faster. Eli looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. The jury said I should have let the law handle it, said I had no right to interfere in local business. What happened to the widow and her children? Clara asked softly. They're safe, living in Denver now. Martha remarried a good man who helps her run a boarding house. A ghost of a smile crossed Eli's face. Her oldest boy writes me letters sometimes. He's 16 now, planning to be a lawyer. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a wall cracking that she'd built to protect her heart. You spent 6 years in prison for protecting a family. The law's the law, Eli said simply. Judge said I should have trusted the system to work. Maybe he was right. And maybe, Margaret said quietly, the system doesn't always protect those who need it most. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Margaret rose, recognizing the dust cloud before she could make out the riders. 2 horses, moving fast, Never a good sign this late in the day. Jake and Tom rounded the bend at a gallop, their horses lathered with sweat. Both men's faces carried the grim expression of bearers of bad news. "Mrs. Hale," Jake called out, pulling his mount to a stop near the porch. "We've got trouble." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "Banker Morrison's coming up the road. Got papers with him, and he doesn't look happy." Tom dismounted, his face grave. "Ma'am, there's something else. We heard talk in town today. Morrison's been asking questions about the ranch's debts. Specific questions." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She'd managed to keep the full extent of their financial troubles from Jake and Tom, hoping to find a solution before it became their problem too. But hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. The sound of a buggy confirmed Jake's warning. Harold Morrison appeared around the bend, his black suit and grim expression marking him as surely as a funeral shroud. The banker had been patient with Margaret's late payments, but patience had limits, and apparently she'd reached his. "Evening, Margaret," Morrison said, climbing down from his buggy with the deliberate movements of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Sorry to call so late, but this couldn't wait." "Harold," Margaret kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "What brings you out this way?" Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. Even in the fading light, Margaret could see the official seal that marked it as legal papers. "I'm afraid it's foreclosure notice, Margaret. The bank can't carry the loan any longer." The words hit her like a physical blow. Clara gasped, and Margaret felt her daughter's small hand slip into hers. "How long do we have?" Margaret's voice sounded strange to her own ears. 60 days to bring the account current. Full payment of outstanding principal plus accumulated interest." Morrison's voice carried genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I know Henry built this place with his own hands, but business is business." Margaret took the papers with fingers that barely trembled. She'd known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. "How much?" she asked quietly. $8,400. The figure hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret had maybe $300 in the bank, and the fall cattle sale wouldn't bring in enough to make a dent in what she owed. "There might be another option," Morrison continued, his tone suggesting he didn't believe it himself. "If you could find a business partner, someone willing to invest in the ranch." "I don't need a partner, Harold. I need time." "I'm afraid time is what we're short of. The bank's board met yesterday. This decision is final." After Morrison left, the porch fell into heavy silence. Jake and Tom stood awkwardly, clearly wanting to offer comfort, but unsure how to navigate their employer's private crisis. "Ma'am," Tom finally said, "if there's anything we can do." "Thank you, Tom, both of you, but there's nothing anyone can do about this." Jake cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, maybe it's time to consider Morrison's suggestion. Find someone to buy into the ranch, keep it running as a going concern." "And lose control of everything Henry built?" "No." Margaret's voice carried the finality of a woman who'd made up her mind. "I won't let strangers own pieces of our home." "Then what?" Tom asked gently. Margaret looked around at the ranch that had been her whole world for over a decade. The house where she'd been a bride, where Clara had taken her first steps, where Henry had died in her arms after the stampede that took him from them. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'll figure something out." As Jake and Tom rode back to their own homes, Margaret found herself alone on the porch with Eli and Clara. Her daughter had been uncharacteristically quiet during the banker's visit, but now the questions came. "Mama, are we going to lose the ranch?" Margaret's heart broke at the fear in Clara's voice. "I don't know, sweetheart, I hope not." "Where would we go?" "I have a sister in Denver. She's offered before." "I don't want to live in Denver," Clara said, tears starting to flow. "I want to stay here. This is home." Margaret pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of sunshine and soap that always clung to Clara's hair. Over her daughter's head, she met Eli's eyes. In them, she saw something that surprised her, not pity, but understanding, the look of a man who'd also lost everything and learned to start over. Mr. Brand, she said quietly, I'm sorry you got mixed up in this. I understand if you need to move on, find work somewhere more stable. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the house to the pastures, where cattle grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk. If it's all the same to you, Mom, he said finally, I'd like to stay. See this through. There might not be wages. Room and board's enough. And Mrs. Hale? Eli's voice carried a quiet certainty that made her look up. Don't give up just yet. Sometimes solutions come from directions we don't expect. That night, after Clara had been tucked into bed with promises that everything would work out somehow, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Henry's journal open before her. Her hands shook slightly as she reached into her pocket and withdrew the folded foreclosure notice. $8,400. It might as well have been $8 million. She picked up her pen and began to write. Received foreclosure notice today. 60 days to find a miracle. Don't know how to tell Clara we might lose everything Henry worked for. Eli offered to stay despite the uncertainty. There's something about that man of strength that runs deeper than what shows on the surface. Henry, if you're watching, I could use some of your wisdom right about now. Outside, the Colorado night settled over the ranch with its familiar sound scattle lowing softly, the whisper of wind through grass, the distant call of an owl. Somewhere in the darkness, Eli Brand lay in the bunkhouse, and Margaret found herself wondering what dreams visited, a man who'd already lost everything once and found the courage to start again. The morning after Morrison's visit dawned grey and cold, matching Margaret's mood as she hitched up the wagon for her trip to town. She'd spent a sleepless night calculating and recalculating figures that stubbornly refused to add up to salvation. $8,000 might as well have been the moon for all her ability to reach it. You sure you don't want me to come with you? Eli asked, checking the wagon's harness with practiced hands. His presence had become a comfort over the past 3 weeks, and Margaret found herself wishing she could accept his offer. But this was her fight, her responsibility. Thank you, but no. Clara's helping you and the boys with the fence repair today. Keep her busy, will you? She's been too quiet since yesterday. Eli nodded, understanding passing between them without words. We'll take care of things here. The ride to Millbrook took 2 hours, giving Margaret plenty of time to rehearse conversations that might save her ranch. The First National Bank of Denver had a branch office above the Mercantile. If Morrison wouldn't extend her loan, perhaps they would see the ranch's potential differently. The bank manager, a thin man named Carlyle with nervous hands and pale eyes, listened to her proposal with the expression of someone attending a funeral. Mrs. Hale, I sympathize with your situation, truly I do, but a woman running a cattle operation alone, he shook his head. It's simply too great a risk for the bank to assume. I've been running the Circle H successfully for 10 years, Margaret countered, fighting to keep her voice level. With mixed results, according to our records. Your mortgage payments have been irregular for the past 18 months. The drought affected everyone's operations, but we're recovering. Are you? Carlyle consulted the papers before him. Your herd is down 30% from 5 years ago. Your mortgage is in arrears, and now you're asking us to assume Harold Morrison's risk. He closed the file with finality. I'm afraid that's impossible. Margaret left the bank with her pride intact but her hopes crushed. The Equipment Loan Office gave her the same polite rejection, as did the Cattle Buyers Association. By noon, she'd exhausted every financial avenue in Millbrook. At the Mercantile, she purchased supplies with coins that felt heavier than they should, each expense a reminder of how little she had left. Mrs. Atibisebi Patterson, the store owner's wife, offered the kind of forced cheerfulness that meant everyone in town already knew about her troubles. Such a shame about the ranch, dear, but perhaps it's for the best. Denver's a fine city for raising a young lady, more opportunities for schooling and such. Margaret managed a non-committal response and escaped as quickly as politeness allowed. The wagon ride home gave her more time to think, but thinking only led to the same impossible conclusion. She needed a miracle, and miracles were in short supply. Back at the ranch, she found Eli working with Clara near the barn. He'd fashioned a small wooden horse from a piece of oak, complete with a flowing mane and tail. Clara held it like treasure, her face bright with the first genuine smile Margaret had seen since Morrison's visit. "Look, Mama, Mr. Eli made this for me. See how pretty she is?" Margaret examined the carving, noting the careful detail work and smooth finish. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Mr. Brand is very talented. Used to whittle during the quiet hours," Eli said simply. "Keeps the hands busy. Can you make one for Jenny Patterson? She's my best friend, and her birthday's next month." "Clara," Margaret began, but Eli held up a hand. "I'd be happy to, Miss Clara, but it'll take some time to get the wood just right." "That's okay. I can wait." As Clara ran off to show her treasure to the barn cats, Margaret found herself studying Eli's profile. There were depths to this man. She was only beginning to understand layers of skill and experience that spoke of a life lived fully before prison took 6 years from him. "How did the town visits go?" he asked quietly. "About as expected. No one wants to loan money to a woman rancher whose mortgage is already in trouble." Eli nodded, unsurprised. "Figured as much. Banks see risk where they should see opportunity." "And what opportunity is that?" "This land's good for more than cattle. Water rights alone are worth considerable money to the right buyer. Railroad's talking about a spur line through the valley. That'll triple property values within 5 years. Margaret stared at him. "How do you know about railroad plans?" Tom mentioned it. Also heard talk at the feed store about mining surveys in the northern hills. Copper, most likely. This whole valley's going to be worth a fortune before long. Which won't help me if I lose the ranch in 60 days. "No, ma'am, it won't, but it might help you find a way to keep it." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, Jake came riding hard from the northern pasture, his face grim with news that made her stomach drop. "Mrs. Hale, we've got trouble. Someone's been at the cattle." The ride to the north pasture revealed the kind of trouble that could destroy a struggling ranch overnight. 20 head of cattle were missing, driven off by rustlers who'd cut the fence and left clear tracks heading toward the Badlands. For an operation already hanging by a thread, the loss was devastating. "Professional job," Jake observed, studying the ground. "Knew exactly what they were doing." Eli dismounted and walked the fence line, reading sign like a man trained to track. 4 riders, maybe 5. Took the youngest steers easier to handle, better price at market. "Should we ride after them?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Trail's 6 hours old," Eli said. "They'll be long gone by now, probably split the herd and scattered the trail." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. The stolen cattle represented nearly $400 in lost income money she desperately needed for the mortgage payment. More importantly, it suggested the rustlers saw the Circle H as easy pickings, a ranch run by a woman without adequate defenses. "This is just the beginning," Jake said grimly. "Once word gets out that we've been hit, every 2-bit thief in the territory will see us as an easy target." "Then we make sure word doesn't get out," Margaret said firmly. "And we make sure this doesn't happen again." "How?" Tom asked. "We can't guard every pasture every night." Margaret looked at Eli, who was still studying the tracks with the focused attention of a man who'd learned to read stories in disturbed earth. "Mr. Brand, you've been quiet. What are you thinking?" Eli straightened, his expression thoughtful. "I'm thinking these boys made a mistake. They got greedy, took too many head for a quick job. That means they've got to move them slow, keep them together long enough to get them to market." "What does that mean for us?" "Means they'll be back. Ranch this size. Woman running it alone. They think they've found a milk cow they can return to whenever they need money." The cold reality of his words settled over the group like a winter wind. Margaret realized she wasn't just fighting to save the ranch from foreclosure, she was fighting to prove she could protect what was hers. "What do you suggest?" she asked. "We set a trap. Let them think we're still easy pickings while we prepare for their return." "You think they'll come back?" "I know they will. Question is whether we'll be ready for them." That evening, after Clara had been settled with her new wooden horse and a promise that the rustlers wouldn't hurt the animals she loved, Margaret found herself on the porch with Eli. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, but their beauty felt distant and cold. $8,000 for the mortgage, 400 lost to rustlers, and now we're marked as an easy target, she said quietly. Tell me honestly, Mr. Brando, you think there's any way to save this place? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the stolen cattle had vanished. I think, he said finally, that sometimes the darkest hour comes just before dawn, and I think you're stronger than you know. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm drowning. Drowning people fight the water. Survivors learn to work with it. Margaret considered his words, wondering if there was wisdom in them, or just the hollow comfort of a man who'd lost everything once himself. Either way, she was grateful not to face the darkness alone. The second cattle theft came 5 days later, bold as brass in broad daylight. This time they took 30 head from the southern pasture, including Margaret's prize-breeding Bullablow that cut deeper than mere financial loss. The bull had been Henry's pride, carefully selected for bloodlines that would improve the entire herd for generations. Margaret stood at the cut fence line, fury and helplessness warring in her chest. Eli knelt nearby, studying the tracks with the intense focus she'd come to recognize as his thinking expression. Same group? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Same lead horse anyway. See this nick in the left front shoe? But they brought more men this time. 7, maybe 8 riders. They're getting bolder. They're testing you, seeing how far they can push before you push back. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. What am I supposed to do? I can't fight 8 armed men. No, Mom, you can't, but you don't have to face them alone. That afternoon, Margaret made a decision that went against every independent instinct she possessed. She rode to Henry's old gun cabinet and withdrew his Winchester rifle, the one that had hung unused since his death. Her hands shook slightly as she checked the action, muscle memory returning from the early days when Henry had insisted she learn to protect herself and their home. The rifle felt heavier than she remembered, weighted with responsibility and the knowledge that she might have to use it. But as she held the familiar stock, she could almost hear Henry's voice. A tool's only as good as the person holding it, Maggie. But sometimes having the right tool makes all the difference. Mama, why are you holding Daddy's gun? Clara's voice came from the doorway, small and worried. Margaret set the rifle carefully on the kitchen table and knelt to meet her daughter's eyes. Because sometimes we have to protect what's ours, sweetheart. Your daddy taught me how to use this rifle, and now I need to remember those lessons. Are the bad men coming back? I hope not. But if they do, I want to be ready. Clara considered this with the serious expression she'd inherited from Henry. Mr. Eli knows about guns too, doesn't he? Yes, he does. Good. Daddy always said 2 people working together could handle most any problem. That evening, Eli found Margaret on the porch, the Winchester across her knees as she watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. He settled on the steps without comment, understanding that sometimes companionship mattered more than conversation. Been a while since you handled that rifle? He asked finally. 10 years. Henry used to take me hunting in the early days, before Clara was born. I was a fair shot once. Fair's better than most. Mind if I ask what your plan is? Margaret's laugh held no humor. Plan? I don't have a plan. I have a rifle and a prayer that I won't need to use it. Might I make a suggestion? I'm listening. Tomorrow, when Jake and Tom come in for the day, we take a ride up to the North Ridge. There's a spot up there where you can see most of the ranch spread out below. Good place to practice shooting without spooking the cattle. You think I need practice? I think everyone needs practice. Skills rust without use, and when trouble comes, you want your hands to remember what your mind might forget. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of mountain air that made every breath feel like a blessing. Margaret rode beside Eli toward the North Ridge, the Winchester in her saddle scabbard and a box of cartridges in her saddlebags. Clara had begged to come along, but Margaret had gently refused. Some lessons were better learned without young eyes watching. The ridge offered a commanding view of the entire Circle H spread, from the main house nestled in its grove of cottonwoods to the distant pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Up here, the ranch looked like something from a picture, book-orderly, prosperous, permanent. The reality of foreclosure notices and rustler threats seemed distant as morning clouds. Eli set up targets using empty cans from the ranch kitchen, placing them at various distances among the rocks. "Start close," he advised. "Build your confidence before you stretch the range." Margaret's first shots were embarrassingly wide, the rifle's kick surprising her despite her memories of handling it before. But Eli was a patient teacher, offering quiet corrections about breathing and sight picture without making her feel foolish for skills grown rusty with disuse. "Don't fight the recoil," he said after her sixth miss. "Accept it, work with it. The rifle wants to jump-let it, but control where it lands." By the 10th shot, she was hitting the cans consistently at 50 yards. By the 20th, she was knocking them off rocks at 100 yards with satisfying regularity. The familiar weight of the Winchester began to feel comfortable again, like greeting an old friend after years apart. "You've got good hands," Eli observed. "Steady, patient. That's worth more than natural talent most times." Henry always said the same thing. He taught me that shooting's not about being fast, it's about being sure. "Smart man, your husband." They practiced for 2 hours, until Margaret felt confident in her ability to hit what she aimed at. As they packed up the targets and empty brass, Eli's expression grew thoughtful. "Mrs. Hale, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you fighting so hard to keep this place? I don't mean to pry, but $8,000 is a powerful lot of money. Might be easier to take Clara and start fresh somewhere else." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze sweeping across the ranch that had been her whole world for more than a decade. "This land isn't just property to me, Mr. Brand. It's where Henry and I planned our future, where Clara took her first steps, where we buried 3 babies who didn't make it past their first winter." Her voice caught slightly. "It's where Henry died in my arms after that stampede, and where I promised him I'd take care of what we'd built together." She turned to face Eli directly. "But more than that, it's Clara's inheritance, her connection to the father she barely remembers. If I lose this place, I lose the last piece of Henry I can give her." Eli nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "That's worth fighting for. Even if the fight seems hopeless?" "Especially then. Hope's easy when things are going well. It's when everything looks lost that hope matters most." As they rode back toward the ranch house, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks, not confidence exactly, but a sense of possibility. The rifle across her saddle felt like more than just a weapon. It felt like a declaration that she wouldn't go quietly into defeat. That evening, as Clara helped prepare supper, she noticed the change in her mother's demeanor. "You look different, Mama. Stronger somehow." Margaret smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. "Just remembering some old lessons, sweetheart. Sometimes we forget how much we're capable of until circumstances remind us." Later, after Clara had gone to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Henry's journal open before her. She wrote carefully, "Practiced with the Winchester today. Eli's a good teacher, patient and encouraging. I'm not the same woman I was when Henry died. Grief and responsibility have changed me. But maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe I'm stronger now than I was then, even if I don't always feel it." Outside, the Colorado night settled over the ranch with its familiar sounds. Somewhere in the darkness, rustlers might be planning their next theft. Somewhere else, banker Morrison was probably calculating interest on loans he'd never extend. But here, in the kitchen where she'd shared 10 years of meals with Henry and 12 years of dreams with Clara, Margaret Hale cleaned her rifle and planned her own kind of war. Margaret was cleaning the bunkhouse when she found the photograph. It had slipped behind Eli's small dresser, a faded image, no bigger than her palm, showing a young woman with kind eyes and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The woman held the child close, both of them smiling at something beyond the camera's view. She should have tucked it back where she'd found it, respected Eli's privacy. Instead, she stood frozen in the small room, studying faces that spoke of love and loss in equal measure. The woman was beautiful in a quiet way, with dark hair and the sort of gentle expression that suggested she'd never met a stranger. The little girl had Eli's eyes, bright and curious, full of the fearless joy that belonged to children who'd never known real danger. The sound of boots on the porch steps sent Margaret scrambling to replace the photograph, but she wasn't quick enough. Eli appeared in the doorway just as she was sliding the picture back behind the dresser. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I was dusting and it fell out. I didn't mean to pry." Eli stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Margaret thought he might be angry at her invasion of his privacy. Instead, he moved to the dresser and retrieved the photograph, holding it with the careful reverence of a man handling something precious and fragile. "My wife Anna, and my daughter Sarah." His voice was steady, but Margaret heard the pain underneath. "Sarah would be 17 now if—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "What happened to them?" Margaret asked softly. Eli sat heavily on the narrow bed, the photograph cradled in his scarred hands. "Comanche raid, summer of 1867. I was away with a cavalry patrol, tracking stolen horses for the army. Thought I'd be gone 3 days, maybe 4. When we got back to the settlement, there was nothing left but ashes and graves." Margaret's heart clenched. She'd lost Henry to accident and illness, devastating blows that had nearly broken her. But to lose a family to violence, to know they'd died afraid and alone while he was away, she couldn't imagine carrying that burden. "The worst part," Eli continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "was that Anna begged me not to go, said she had a bad feeling, wanted me to stay home that week. But the army needed trackers, and the pay was good. I told her feelings weren't facts, that I'd be careful and back before she knew it." "You couldn't have known." "Couldn't I?" Eli's eyes met hers, and she saw the guilt that had eaten at him for years. "I was a scout, Mrs. Hale, reading sign, sensing danger that was my job. Anna had good instincts about people, about trouble. I should have listened." Margaret sat beside him on the narrow bed, close enough to offer comfort without presuming too much. "If you'd stayed, you might have died with them." "Maybe. Or maybe I could have gotten them to safety. Maybe I could have made a difference. Or maybe you're torturing yourself with questions that have no good answers." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who'd wrestled with her own guilt. "I blamed myself for months after Henry died. If I'd insisted he stay home that day, if I'd made him take someone else to help drive the cattle, if I'd been a better wife so he didn't feel pressured to work so hard." She shook her head. "Guilt's a luxury we can't afford when there are people depending on us." Eli studied her face, seeing something there that made him ask, "Is that why you fight so hard for Clara? Because you couldn't save Henry?" The question hit closer to home than Margaret wanted to admit. "Maybe. Or maybe I fight because it's all I know how to do anymore." Before Eli could respond, the sound of riders approaching at speed brought them both to their feet. Through the bunkhouse window, Margaret saw Jake and Tom galloping toward the main house, their faces grim with familiar bad news. They met the ranch hands on the porch, where Clara sat with her wooden horse, blissfully unaware that more trouble was bearing down on them. "Another hit?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Worse," Jake panted, his horse still blowing hard from the ride. "They didn't just take cattle this time, they hit the Patterson place too, and old Morrison's ranch. Took everything that wasn't nailed down and burned what they couldn't carry." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. "Anyone hurt?" "Patterson's boy took a bullet in the leg trying to protect their milk cow. He'll live, but he won't be walking normal for a while." Tom dismounted, his face showing the strain of a man who'd seen too much violence for one day. "It's not random anymore, Mrs. Hale. Someone's organizing these hits, making them bigger and bolder. They're sending a message." "What message?" "That normal folks can't protect what's theirs. That maybe it's time to sell out and move on while they still can." Eli stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "How many ranches hit in the last month?" "6, counting ours," Jake replied. "All small operations, all run by folks without much help." "All easy targets," Eli murmured. "Someone's testing the territory's defenses, seeing who'll fight and who'll fold." Margaret's mind raced through the implications. If the rustling was organized, coordinated, then her ranch wasn't just dealing with opportunistic thieves, they were facing something much more dangerous. "There's something else," Tom added reluctantly. "Sheriff Hawkins called a meeting for tomorrow night. Town council wants to discuss defensive measures for the valley." "What kind of defensive measures?" "Word is they're talking about hiring professional help, gun hands to patrol the valley and discourage future raids." Margaret felt her stomach drop. Professional gun hands meant mercenaries, men who solved problems with violence and expected payment in cash she didn't have. How much would that cost? $200 per ranch, they're saying. Money up front, with more if the trouble continues. $200 she didn't have to pay for protection she couldn't afford, against threats that might destroy everything she'd worked to build. Margaret felt the walls closing in from all directions, foreclosure from one side, rustlers from another, and now her own neighbors demanding payment for safety. "I'll go to the meeting," she said finally. "Hear what they have to say." "Mrs. Hale," Jake said carefully, "maybe it's time to consider that offer from your sister in Denver. Clara would be safe there, and you could start fresh without all this trouble." "No." Margaret's voice carried the finality of a woman who'd made up her mind. "This is our home. These are our neighbors. If we run every time there's trouble, where does it end?" That evening, after Clara had been put to bed with promises that the bad men wouldn't come to their house, Margaret found Eli on the porch. He sat in Henry's old chair, the photograph of his family in his hands, lost in memories that seemed to pain and comfort him in equal measure. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret settled in her own chair, the one she'd occupied through countless evening conversations with Henry. "Yes, ma'am." "Why did you stay? After losing Anna and Sarah, after prison, why didn't you just keep moving, find somewhere without memories?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph. "Tried that for a while, drifted from town to town, job to job, thinking distance would make the pain less. But grief's not something you can outrun. It follows you wherever you go." "Then why stay here, with us?" "Because sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living. Anna would have liked you, Mrs. Hale, would have admired your strength, your devotion to Clara. And Sarah," his voice caught slightly, "Sarah would have loved having a friend like Clara, someone brave and kind and full of questions about everything." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I." They sat in comfortable silence as the Colorado night settled around them, two people who'd lost everything once and found the courage to risk caring again. Somewhere in the darkness, rustlers might be planning their next strike. Somewhere else, bankers and neighbors were making decisions about their future without consulting them. But here, on the porch of the ranch Henry built, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since the foreclosure notice arrived. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning woman, but the steady hope of someone who'd found an ally in the fight ahead. The morning of the town meeting, Margaret pinned her mother's cameo brooch to the collar of her best dress, the same cameo her grandmother had worn to town council meetings in Missouri, where she'd been the first woman to speak publicly about the need for a schoolhouse. The small piece of carved shell and gold had been passed down through 3 generations of strong women, each one facing challenges that would have broken weaker spirits. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she fastened the delicate clasp. Her mother had always said the cameo carried the strength of the women who'd worn it before, but this morning it felt more like a weight than a blessing. "You look pretty, Mama," Clara said from the doorway, her wooden horse tucked under one arm. "Are you going somewhere important?" "Town meeting tonight, sweetheart. Just boring, grown-up talk about ranch business." Clara studied her mother's face with the uncanny perception of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions. "You're worried." "A little. But that's what grown-ups do, worry so children don't have to. Mr. Eli says worrying's like rocking in a chair, gives you something to do but doesn't get you anywhere." Margaret smiled despite her anxiety. "Mr. Brand is full of wisdom, isn't he? He says when people try to scare you, it's usually because they're scared of something themselves." The simplicity of the observation struck Margaret with unexpected force. The rustlers, the bankers, even the town council demanding payment for protection, maybe they were all operating from fear rather than strength. The thought didn't make her problems smaller, but it shifted her perspective in a way that felt important. By evening, Margaret's resolve had crystallized into something harder than diamond. She rode into Millbrook with her mother's cameo catching the lamplight, and Henry's Winchester in her saddle, scabbard not as a threat, but as a statement. Margaret Hale was not a woman who could be easily moved. The town hall buzzed with nervous energy as ranchers and business owners discussed the rustling problem in hushed tones. Margaret recognized most faces these were her neighbors, people she'd known for years, but tonight they looked at her with expressions ranging from pity to irritation. The widow with the failing ranch, the woman who couldn't protect her own property. Sheriff Hawkins called the meeting to order with the weary authority of a man who'd seen too much trouble and not enough solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know why we're here. The rustling situation has escalated beyond what local law enforcement can handle alone. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Margaret noticed how many men had their wives beside them, presenting united fronts against the uncertainty. She felt the absence of Henry like a physical ache. "I've been in contact with a company out of Denver," Hawkins continued. "Professional security services experienced in dealing with organized criminal activity. They're willing to establish a presence in our valley for the remainder of the season." "What's it going to cost?" called out Jim Patterson, his arm in a sling from the recent raid on his ranch. $200 per ranch, payable in advance. Additional fees if the situation requires extended operations. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $200 was more than most small ranchers made in a good month. "What about folks who can't afford that kind of money?" asked Tom Wheeler from the back of the room. Hawkins looked uncomfortable. "The security company requires payment from all participating ranches. They can't protect some properties, and ignore others it would compromise the entire operation." Margaret felt the trap closing around her. Pay money she didn't have for protection she couldn't afford, or be excluded from the valley's defense and left even more vulnerable than before. "Mrs. Hale," called out Harold Morrison from his seat near the front, "your ranch has been hit twice already. What's your position on this proposal?" All eyes turned to Margaret, and she felt the weight of their expectations. They wanted her to admit defeat, to acknowledge that a woman alone couldn't handle the responsibilities of ranch ownership. Some probably hoped she'd announce her intention to sell, removing one source of perceived weakness from their community's defenses. Margaret rose slowly, her hand unconsciously touching the cameo at her throat. "My position, Mr. Morrison, is that paying criminals for protection is just another form of theft. We'd be letting fear drive us into bankruptcy while rewarding the very behavior we're trying to stop. So what do you suggest?" Morrison's tone carried the patronizing patience of a man humoring a child. "That we all just hope for the best? I suggest we remember that this valley was settled by people who didn't run from trouble. My husband and I came here with nothing but determination and the belief that honest work could build something lasting. Henry didn't carry a gun because he wanted to, but because sometimes good people have to stand up to bad ones." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke, drawing on reserves of conviction she'd forgotten she possessed. "These rustlers are counting on us to be afraid, to pay whatever they demand, rather than fight for what's ours. But what happens when $200 isn't enough? When they want 400 or 1,000, or just decide to take our ranches outright? And what happens when they decide to start killing people instead of just stealing cattle?" Morrison shot back. "Are you willing to risk your daughter's life to prove a point about independence?" The question hit Margaret like a slap, touching her deepest fear. But instead of backing down, she thought of her mother, her grandmother, all the women who'd worn the cameo before her and faced impossible choices with courage rather than compromise. "My daughter's life is exactly what I'm fighting for, Mr. Morrison. Her future, her inheritance, her right to grow up in a place where people stand together against trouble instead of paying others to handle their problems." The room fell silent, tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Margaret could feel the division in the crowd, some sympathetic to her position, others frustrated by her refusal to go along with the majority. Sheriff Hawkins cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hale, I respect your position, but the security company needs unanimous participation or they won't take the contract. Your decision affects everyone." Margaret felt the pressure of their expectations, the weight of being the obstacle between her neighbors and their peace of mind. Part of her wanted to give in, to avoid being the woman who stood in the way of community safety. Instead, she thought of Eli, of his quiet strength and his understanding that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. "Then I guess you'll need to find another solution," she said quietly, "because I won't be bullied into bankruptcy by criminals or neighbors." She walked out of the town hall with her head high and her mother's cameo catching the lamplight, leaving behind a room full of people who didn't know whether to admire her courage or curse her stubbornness. The ride home gave her time to wonder if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. By morning, word would spread throughout the valley that Margaret Hale had single-handedly prevented the hiring of professional protection. If the rustlers struck again, she'd bear the blame for whatever happened. But as she rode through the night toward the ranch where Eli waited with Clara, Margaret felt something unexpected: pride. Not the brittle pride of a woman too stubborn to admit defeat, but the deep satisfaction of someone who'd stood up for her principles when it mattered most. Her mother's cameo seemed to warm against her skin, carrying the approval of generations of strong women who'd faced their own impossible choices and found the courage to choose honor over safety. Clara found the badge while playing hide-and-seek with the barn cats. She'd been chasing Patches, the orange tabby, when he darted into the tack room where Eli kept his few belongings. The cat had knocked over a worn leather saddlebag, spilling its contents across the dusty floor. Most of what tumbled out was unremarkable: spare shirt, a small Bible, a handful of letters tied with string. But there, glinting in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the barn door, was something that made Clara's 12-year-old mind race with excitement and confusion. A sheriff's badge. 5-pointed star, polished silver, with words etched around the edge that she couldn't quite make out. "Mama," Clara called, her voice echoing in the barn as she clutched the badge to her chest. "Mama, come quick." Margaret hurried from the house, alarmed by the urgency in her daughter's voice. She found Clara in the tack room, surrounded by scattered belongings, holding the badge like a treasure she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch. "What is it, sweetheart? What's wrong?" "I was chasing Patches, and his bag fell over, and look what I found." Clara held up the badge, her eyes bright with discovery. "Mr. Eli's a sheriff." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she took the badge from Clara's small hands. The metal was warm from her daughter's touch, and the engraving was clear despite years of handling. U.S. Marshal, Federal Territory of Colorado. Not a sheriff, a federal marshal. "Clara, put Mr. Brand's things back where you found them," Margaret said quietly, her mind reeling with implications. "Right now." "But Mama, isn't it exciting? He's a lawman, like the heroes in the stories." "Clara." "Now." Something in her mother's tone made Clara move quickly to gather the scattered belongings. Margaret stood frozen, staring at the badge that changed everything she thought she knew about the man who'd been living in their bunkhouse, eating at their table, teaching her daughter to whittle and herself to trust again. The sound of approaching horses made Margaret slip the badge into her apron pocket. Through the barn door, she saw Eli riding in from the north pasture with Jake and Tom, all three men's faces grim with the expression that had become too familiar over the past weeks. "More trouble?" she asked as they dismounted. "Found fresh sign near the river," Jake reported. "Looks like they've been watching the ranch, learning our routines." "How many?" Margaret's voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and controlled. "Hard to say for certain," Eli replied, studying her face with the sharp attention she now realized was professional rather than personal. "But they're getting bolder. Won't be long before they make another move." Tom nodded agreement. "We should think about moving the remaining cattle closer to the house, maybe setting up a watch rotation." "Good idea," Margaret said automatically, her hand unconsciously touching the badge in her pocket. You three work out the details. I need to start supper. She walked toward the house on unsteady legs, Clara skipping beside her, chattering about the exciting discovery of Eli's secret career in law enforcement. Margaret barely heard her daughter's words, too focused on the weight of metal in her pocket and the growing certainty that nothing about Eli Brand was what it seemed. After Clara had been sent to gather eggs for supper, Margaret confronted Eli on the porch. She placed the badge on the small table between their chairs, the silver catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight. Care to explain this, Marshal Brand? Eli's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a wariness that confirmed her suspicions even before he spoke. Where did you find that? Clara was playing in the barn. Your saddlebag spilled. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Federal Marshal, how long have you been lying to me? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the badge to Margaret's face. I never lied to you, Mrs. Hale. Everything I told you about my past, about Anna and Sarah, about the shooting that sent me to prison, all of it was true. But you left out the part about being a federal officer. Yes, ma'am, I did. Why? The single word carried all her hurt and confusion. Eli picked up the badge, turning it over in his scarred hands. Because I'm here on assignment. Have been since the day I showed up at your gate. Margaret felt the bottom drop out of her world. Assignment? Tracking a man named Jackson Donovan. Goes by Black Jack to most folks. He's been running rustling operations throughout Colorado and Wyoming for the past 2 years, always staying one step ahead of local law enforcement. The rustler gang that's been hitting the valley. Led by Donovan, yes. The Territorial Marshal's office has been tracking his organization for months. When reports started coming in about coordinated raids in this area, they sent me to investigate. Margaret stared at him. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed clicking into place. The job at my ranch. Perfect cover. Drifter looking for work, no questions asked. Gave me a reason to be in the valley, watching and waiting. And my daughter falling in the creek. Was that part of your assignment too? Eli's head snapped up, hurt flashing in his eyes. No, that was real, Mrs. Hale. Everything between us, everything with Clara, that's all real. How am I supposed to know what's real anymore? Margaret's voice cracked, despite her efforts to stay strong. You've been lying to me for weeks. I've been doing my job. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been using my family as cover while you hunt criminals. Using Clara's affection, using my... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Using your what? Eli's voice was quiet, intent. My trust. My feelings. Margaret stood abruptly, needing distance from the man who'd somehow become so important to her while maintaining such a fundamental deception. God, I've been such a fool. You haven't been foolish. You've been kind to a stranger who needed kindness. That's not something to regret. Even when the stranger has been lying about who he is. Eli was quiet for a long moment, the badge heavy in his hands. I never meant for it to go this far. The assignment was supposed to be simple track Donovan's movements, gather intelligence, coordinate with local law when we had enough evidence for arrest. What changed? You did. Clara did. This place did. Eli's voice carried a raw honesty that made Margaret pause despite her anger. I haven't had a home or a family in 15 years. Forgot what it felt like to matter to someone, to have someone matter to me. So you decided to play house while you hunted criminals? I decided to care about people who deserved better than to be used as cover for a federal investigation. And yes, that complicated everything. Margaret sank back into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications of his revelation. How close are you to catching this Donovan? Close. His pattern suggests he'll hit this ranch, next biggest operation, most cattle, woman, running it alone. It's exactly the kind of target he prefers. So you've been waiting for him to attack us? I've been preparing for him to attack you. There's a difference. And when he does, what happens to Clara and me during your federal operation? Eli met her eyes directly. Nothing happens to you. That's a promise I'm making as a man, not as a marshal. Your promises don't mean much to me right now, Mr. Brand. Or is it Marshal Brand? It's Eli, just Eli. Everything else is complications I never wanted. Clara's voice drifted from the kitchen, calling for her mother to help with the eggs. Margaret stood slowly, feeling older than her 32 years. I need time to think about this, about what it means, what I'm going to do. Mrs. Hale, Margaret, please don't do anything hasty. Donovan's dangerous, more dangerous than you know, if you send me away now. Are you threatening me, Marshal? I'm warning you. Black Jack Donovan has killed 11 people that we know of. He won't hesitate to add you and Clara to that list if you get in his way. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. Then maybe it's time I contacted the real law enforcement. Sheriff Hawkins should know there's a federal operation in his territory. You can't. Eli's voice was urgent now. Donovan has sources inside local law enforcement. It's how he's stayed ahead of us for so long. If word gets out that I'm here, he'll disappear and start over somewhere else, leaving us safe. Leaving him free to terrorize other families, other children. Is that what you want? Margaret stared at him, seeing the federal marshal for the first time, instead of the gentleman who'd saved her daughter and taught her to shoot again. What I want is for you to leave, tonight. Margaret, get your things, Marshal Brand. Be gone before Clara wakes up in the morning. Eli stood slowly, the badge still in his hands. If I leave now, you'll be defenseless when Donovan comes, and he will come. Then I'll face him without lies and deception complicating things. You'll face him alone. I've been alone before. I'll manage. As Eli walked toward the bunkhouse to collect his belongings, Margaret remained on the porch, watching the man she'd thought she knew disappear into the gathering darkness. The badge lay on the table where he'd left it, catching the lamplight from the kitchen window. Inside the house, Clara was humming while she prepared the eggs for tomorrow's breakfast, blissfully unaware that her world was about to change again. Margaret touched her mother's cameo, drawing what comfort she could from the connection to women who'd faced impossible choices before her. She'd thought she was falling in love with a reformed outlaw seeking redemption. Instead, she'd been harboring a federal marshal, using her family as cover for a dangerous investigation. Margaret Hale had faced many hard truths in her 32 years, but this one felt like it might break her heart beyond repair. The morning after Eli's departure dawned grey and cold, matching the emptiness that had settled over the Circle H ranch like a shroud. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching Jake struggle with tasks that Eli had made look effortless. The broken gate that had needed 2 men to lift now required 3, and the cattle seemed more restless without Eli's calm presence in the pastures. Clara had been heartbroken to discover Eli gone, his bunk stripped clean, and no note of explanation beyond Margaret's careful words about misunderstandings between adults. The wooden horse he'd carved sat on Clara's bedside table, a tangible reminder of the man who'd briefly felt like family. "Where did he go, Mama?" Clara asked for the 4th time since breakfast, her young face etched with confusion and loss. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to leave even when we don't want them to. But he didn't say goodbye. Mr. Eli always says goodbye." Margaret's heart clenched at the hurt in her daughter's voice. She'd told herself that ordering Eli to leave was the right choice. How could she trust a man who'd built his entire presence in their lives on deception? But watching Clara's faith in adult reliability left her questioning everything. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the main road. A single rider was coming up the path, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. For a moment, Margaret's heart leaped, thinking Eli had returned. Then she recognized the Strangera tall man in a black duster, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Margaret stepped onto the porch, Henry's Winchester cradled in her arms. The rider pulled up 20 feet from the house, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. His horse was well cared for but travel-worn, suggesting he'd ridden hard to get here. "Morning, Ma'am. Mrs. Hale, I presume." "I am. What can I do for you, Mr. Donovan? Jackson Donovan." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. though most folks call me Black Jack." Margaret's blood turned to ice. The rustler leader himself, sitting on her property as casual as a neighbor dropping by for coffee. She tightened her grip on the rifle, acutely aware that Clara was somewhere behind her in the house. "I know who you are, Mr. Donovan. You're not welcome here." "Now, that's not very neighborly, Mrs. Hale, especially considering I've come to make you an offer." "I'm not interested in anything you're selling." Donovan chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling downhill. "Oh, but you haven't heard what I'm offering yet. See, I know you're in a spot of trouble with the bank. Foreclosure notice, 60 days to pay up. That's a powerful burden for a woman alone." Margaret's mind raced. How did he know about the foreclosure? Then she remembered Eli's warning about Donovan having sources in local law enforcement. The man had connections throughout the territory, eyes and ears in places she'd never suspected. "What's your point, Mr. Donovan?" "My point is that I'm prepared to solve your problem. $8,400, paid in full to Harold Morrison's bank. Your ranch free and clear. No more debt hanging over your head." The offer hit Margaret like a physical blow. Everything she'd been fighting for, struggling to save, handed to her on a silver platter by the very man who'd been stealing from her. And in return, nothing too demanding, just the use of your ranch as a base of operations for my business interests. You keep running cattle, keep living your life, and I conduct a little commerce from your back pastures. Everybody wins. Your commerce being cattle theft. I prefer to think of it as wealth redistribution, taking from those who have too much and giving to those who appreciate it more. Margaret felt sick. The man was offering to save her ranch by turning it into a criminal headquarters, making her complicit in the very crimes that had been terrorizing her neighbors. "And if I refuse?" Donovan's smile faded, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Well, that would be unfortunate. See, Mrs. Hale, I'm not a patient man, and I don't take kindly to obstacles. You can be part of the solution, or you can be part of the problem. But either way, I'm getting what I want, which is control of this valley. Your ranch sits right in the middle of the best cattle country in Colorado, with water rights and access roads that make it perfect for my needs. I've spent months clearing out the smaller operations, convincing folks to sell and move on. You're the last holdout." Margaret's mind flashed to the Patterson Ranch, the Morrison place, all the neighbors who'd suffered under Donovan's campaign of terror. "You've been driving people out deliberately." "Business is business, ma'am. Can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. Those eggs are families, people's livelihoods. People adapt, find new places, start over. It's the natural order of things." Clara appeared in the doorway behind Margaret, drawn by the sound of voices. Donovan's eyes fixed on the 12-year-old girl with an intensity that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Pretty little thing," he said softly. "Reminds me of my own daughter at that age. Be a shame if something were to happen to her because her mama made poor choices." The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Margaret stepped sideways, blocking Donovan's view of Clara while raising the Winchester to her shoulder. "Get off my land. Now." Donovan raised his hands in mock surrender, but his expression remained amused rather than threatened. "No need for violence, Mrs. Hale. I'm just here to talk business. We have nothing to discuss." "Oh, but we do. See, I know all about your friend Marshall Brand. No, he's been sniffing around, pretending to be a drifter while gathering intelligence on my operations." Margaret felt her heart skip. If Donovan knew about Eli's true identity, then everything was more dangerous than she'd realized. "No, he left last night too," Donovan continued. "Packed up and rode out like his tail was on fire. Makes a man wonder what might have caused such a sudden departure." Margaret kept the rifle trained on Donovan's chest, fighting to keep her expression neutral. She couldn't let him know that Eli's departure had been her decision, couldn't give him any advantage in the psychological game he was playing. "Federal marshals come and go," she said carefully. "Their business is no concern of mine." "Isn't it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you sent away the only protection you had. That strikes me as either very brave or very foolish. Maybe I just don't need protection from men who fight fair." Donovan laughed, genuine amusement lighting his eyes for the first time. "Fair fightings for sporting contests, Mrs. Hale. This is business, and business has only one rule: win or lose. Everything else is just sentiment." "Clara, go inside and help Jake with the accounts," Margaret said firmly, not taking her eyes off Donovan. "But Mama." "Now, sweetheart." Clara reluctantly obeyed, but Margaret could feel her daughter's frightened gaze through the kitchen window. Having Clara witness this confrontation felt like exposure to poison, but sending her away completely might provoke Donovan into more direct action. "Smart girl," Donovan observed. "Knows when to listen to her elders. That's a valuable trait in a child." "What do you really want, Donovan?" "I told you what I want. This ranch as my base of operations, you as my unwilling but cooperative partner. I've got 12 men riding with me now, Mrs. Hale. 12 men who follow orders without question and don't trouble themselves with conscience. 12 against one woman and a child. Those must be some dangerous men to need such overwhelming odds. 12 against however many federal marshals might be lurking in the area," Donovan corrected. "I don't believe for a second that Brand was working alone. Marshals travel in packs when they're hunting something dangerous." Margaret realized with growing dread that Donovan was probing for information, trying to determine how much law enforcement attention his operation had attracted. Her answers could determine whether he saw the ranch as a safe haven or a trap to be avoided. "I wouldn't know," she said. "Like I said, their business is no concern of mine." "Maybe not, but their business has a way of becoming everyone's concern when bullets start flying." Donovan gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "I'm going to give you 24 hours to consider my offer, Mrs. Hale. Think about your daughter, your future, the very real possibility that stubbornness might cost you more than money. And if I refuse, then tomorrow night my boys and I will be back to collect what we want anyway. Only then you won't get paid for it, and you might not be around to object." Donovan wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving Margaret standing on her porch with a rifle in her hands and ice in her veins. She watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then sank into Henry's old chair as her legs gave out beneath her. 24 hours. One day to find a miracle or watch everything she'd fought for disappear in flames. Inside the house, Clara appeared at her elbow, small and warm and infinitely precious. "Mama, who was that man? He scared me." Margaret pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of sunshine and innocence. "A bad man, sweetheart, but he's gone now." "Will he come back?" Margaret's arms tightened around Clara. She wanted to lie, to offer comfortable reassurance that would help her daughter sleep peacefully. Instead, she chose honesty. "He might, but if he does, we'll be ready for him." "How?" Margaret looked around the ranch that Henry had built with his own hands, the home where she'd planned to raise Clara in safety and peace. Tomorrow night, it might all be over, lost to foreclosure or stolen by criminals, the difference academic in the face of complete defeat. But as she held her daughter and watched the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Margaret realized something important. She wasn't the same terrified widow who'd hidden behind doors and bank loans. The past weeks had changed her, taught her that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but we'll figure it out together." That night, after Clara had been tucked into bed with extra kisses and promises that morning would come safely, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and wrote what might be her final entry in Henry's journal. "Donovan came today, offered to save the ranch in exchange for turning it into his criminal headquarters. 24 hours to decide. Clara asks if he'll come back, and I don't know how to protect her from the truth. Eli was right about the danger, but I sent him away because I couldn't stand the deception. Now I wonder if pride will cost us everything. If you're watching, Henry, send me wisdom, send me strength, send me a miracle." Outside, the Colorado night settled over the ranch with its familiar sound scattle lowing softly, wind through grass, the distant call of an owl. But tonight, the darkness felt pregnant with menace, full of shadows that might be hiding 12 armed men waiting for tomorrow's sunset. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. Margaret had spent the night checking and rechecking Henry's Winchester, counting ammunition, and trying to devise a defense plan that didn't end with her and Clara dead in their own home. By sunrise, she'd accepted the grim mathematics of their situation: one woman and a 12-year-old girl against 12 hardened criminals was not a battle that could be won by conventional means. But Margaret Hale had never been a conventional woman. "Clara, I need you to listen very carefully," she said over breakfast, keeping her voice calm despite the terror eating at her heart. "Remember the hiding place your daddy showed you? Under the root cellar, behind the preserves?" Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth, eggs growing cold as understanding dawned in her young eyes. "The bad man's coming back. He might, and if he does, I need you to hide there and not come out until I call for you. No matter what you hear, no matter how scared you get, you stay hidden until I say it's safe. What about you? I'll be protecting our home, like your daddy would have done." Clara set down her fork, her appetite forgotten. "I don't want to hide while you fight alone. And I don't want to fight at all. But sometimes we don't get to choose what happens to us. We only get to choose how we respond." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's small hand. "Your job is to stay safe so I can focus on keeping us both alive. Can you do that for me?" Clara nodded solemnly, tears threatening but not falling. "Yes, Mama." Jake and Tom arrived at their usual time, but Margaret could see the tension in their faces. Word of Donovan's visit had somehow reached them either through town gossip or the mysterious network of information that seemed to flow through the territory like water. "Mrs. Hale," Jake said carefully, "maybe it's time to consider taking Clara and leaving for a while, just until this trouble blows over." "And go where?" "Donovan made it clear that running won't solve anything. He wants this ranch, and he'll keep coming until he gets it." "Then maybe give it to him," Tom suggested desperately. "It's just land and cattle. Your lives are worth more than property." Margaret understood their fear. They were good men who'd signed on to work cattle, not fight outlaws. "You're both free to leave if you want. This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't," Jake said firmly. "We've worked this ranch for 5 years. It's our home too." "Then help me make it defensible. Tom, I need you to move the remaining cattle into the home pasture, close enough to watch. Jake, check every window and door for firing positions. And both of you, if shooting starts, your job is to protect Clara, not me." The men nodded grimly and headed out to their tasks. Margaret spent the morning preparing for war, filling water buckets in case of fire, moving ammunition to strategic locations, boarding up windows that offered no defensive advantage. Each preparation felt like a step closer to admitting that violence was inevitable. As the sun reached its peak, Margaret found herself standing in the room where Henry had died, looking at the bed where she'd held him during his final hours. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to risk everything to save a place that held as much pain as joy. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope you'd understand." The afternoon stretched endlessly, each shadow potentially hiding enemies, each sound possibly signaling attack. Clara helped with preparations despite her fear, showing a courage that made Margaret proud and heartbroken in equal measure. This wasn't the childhood she'd wanted for her daughter, hiding in root cellars while men fought over property rights. As sunset approached, Margaret positioned herself on the porch with Henry's Winchester across her knees. Jake took the barn with a clear view of the main approach, while Tom watched the back of the house from the kitchen window. Clara was safely hidden in the root cellar, with instructions not to emerge until given the all-clear. The waiting was agony. Every minute that passed without attack felt like borrowed time, but also increased the tension until Margaret thought she might scream from the strain. Her hands were steady on the rifle, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Then she saw them. 12 riders came over the ridge at a leisurely pace, confident in their numbers and the terror they'd inspired. Donovan rode at the front, his black duster making him look like death itself in the fading light. Behind him, his men spread out in a semicircle, cutting off escape routes and presenting multiple targets. They stopped just beyond rifle range, a calculated insult that demonstrated their confidence. Donovan called out across the distance between them. "Evening, Mrs. Hale. I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer." "I have," Margaret called back, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "My answer is no." "That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve this like civilized people." "Civilized people don't threaten children." Donovan's laugh carried clearly in the evening air. "Children learn from their parents' examples, Mrs. Hale. What exactly are you teaching your daughter by choosing pride over practical sense?" "I'm teaching her that some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting means dying." Margaret stood slowly, the Winchester rising with her, especially then. The first shot came from Jake's position in the barn, a warning shot that kicked up dust near Donovan's horse, close enough to demonstrate that the Circle H wouldn't surrender without a fight. Margaret felt pride surge through her terror as she realized her ranch hands had chosen to stand with her, despite the odds. "Well," Donovan called out, his voice carrying amusement rather than concern, "I suppose that answers any questions about your intentions. Boys, Mrs. Hale has decided to make this interesting." The outlaws spread wider, some dismounting to take cover behind rocks and trees, while others remained mounted for mobility. Margaret recognized the tactics of men experienced in violence, coordinated and professional. These weren't desperate thieves, they were soldiers in everything but uniform. "Mrs. Hale," Donovan continued, "last chance to reconsider. Send out that little girl of yours and we'll make this quick and painless." The threat to Clara galvanized Margaret like nothing else could have. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder and sent a bullet whistling past Donovan's ear, close enough to part his hair. "Touch my daughter and I'll kill you myself," she called back. Donovan's laughter died. "Have it your way?" The battle erupted with sudden violence that shattered the evening peace. Muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers in the gathering darkness as outlaws opened fire from multiple positions. Margaret dove behind the porch railing as bullets splintered wood around her, splinters stinging her face and hands. From the barn, Jake's rifle answered with steady, measured shots. Tom's position at the kitchen window added its voice to the defense, creating crossfire that forced the outlaws to keep their heads down. But 12 against 3 was mathematics that couldn't be argued with indefinitely. Margaret rolled to a new position and sent 2 quick shots toward an outlaw, trying to flank the house through the vegetable garden. One shot missed, but the second caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind the corn rows. "Good shot, Mama!" Clara's voice drifted from the root cellar despite strict instructions to stay silent. "Stay down, sweetheart," Margaret called back, terrified that her daughter's voice might draw enemy fire. An outlaw with a rifle had worked his way close to the barn, threatening Jake's position. Margaret drew careful aim and squeezed the trigger, watching the man crumple. The familiar kick of Henry's rifle felt like an old friend's handshakes, steady, reliable, comforting. But the outlaws were learning, adapting their tactics to the defenders' positions. 3 men dismounted and began working their way around the house's blind side, while others kept up suppressing fire to pin down Jake and Tom. Margaret realized with cold clarity that they were being outflanked, overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. In minutes, maybe less, the outlaws would be inside the house. She had one chance to shift the odds, one desperate gamble that might save Clara, even if it cost Margaret her own life. She gathered her courage and called out across the darkening battlefield. "Donovan, I've got something you want information about Marshal Brand's investigation. But I'll only deal with you directly." The firing slackened as Donovan considered her offer. "What kind of information?" "The kind that could save your organization or destroy it. But you'll have to come close enough to hear it." Margaret prayed that greed and curiosity would overcome Donovan's caution. She was counting on the arrogance that had brought him here personally, instead of sending subordinates to do his dirty work. "You're trying to draw me into range," Donovan observed. "I'm trying to save my daughter's life. Your information or her safety, choose one." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Margaret heard the sound she'd been praying for, hoofbeats approaching at a gallop from the east, coming fast and hard through the darkness. At first, she thought it might be more outlaws, reinforcements that would seal their doom. Then she heard something that made her heart leap with impossible hope, the distinctive war cry of cavalry soldiers charging into battle. Eli's voice cut through the night like a sword. "Federal marshals, throw down your weapons!" The outlaws spun toward this new threat, their carefully planned attack dissolving into confusion as a dozen mounted lawmen crashed into their positions. Margaret saw Eli's familiar silhouette in the lead, something glinting in his hand that caught the last rays of sunlight. A cavalry saber. Eli rode with his father's Civil War saber, raised high, the blade that had seen action from Gettysburg to Appomattox now serving justice in the Colorado Territory. The outlaw nearest the house turned to fire at the approaching marshals, presenting his back to Margaret. She didn't hesitate. Her shot took him center mass, dropping him before he could squeeze his trigger. Donovan wheeled his horse toward the charging lawman, his face twisted with rage at seeing his carefully laid plans collapse. "Kill them all!" he shouted to his remaining men. But discipline and training told in the chaos that followed. The marshals fought with coordinated precision, while the outlaws, caught between multiple enemies, began to break and scatter. Margaret watched Eli's saber slice through the evening air as he engaged two outlaws simultaneously, his cavalry training evident in every movement. The man she'd thought was a gentle ex-convict revealed himself as a warrior born, deadly and magnificent in his element. A bullet smashed into the porch railing inches from Margaret's head, reminding her that the battle wasn't over. She swung her rifle toward the source and saw Donovan himself advancing on foot, his revolver trained on her position. "You meddling bitch," he snarled. "This is all your fault." Margaret's rifle was empty, no time to reload. Clara was hidden directly below where she crouched, and Donovan's next shot would likely go right through the porch floor into the root cellar. Time slowed as Margaret realized she had one chance to save her daughter. She launched herself from the porch, tackling Donovan around the waist and sending both of them tumbling into the dirt. His revolver discharged harmlessly into the air as they fell, then skittered away across the yard. 3 months later, the Circle H ranch bloomed with a vitality that would have made Henry proud. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures unmarked by violence, and the sound of Clara's laughter drifted from the barn where she was teaching Eli's horse to accept a bridle with the patient persistence of someone who'd learned that good things took time. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her daughter work with the same gentle confidence that Eli had shown during his first days on the ranch. The wooden horse he'd carved still occupied a place of honor on Clara's dresser, but now it shared space with other Treasuress Marshall's badge that Eli had let her hold during the badge-pinning ceremony, a piece of Black Jack Donovan's stolen jewelry that had been returned to its rightful owner, and a pressed flower from her mother's wedding bouquet. The wedding had been a simple affair, held in the ranch's main room with Sheriff Hawkins officiating and half the territory in attendance. Margaret had worn her mother's cameo and a dress of pale blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, while Eli stood beside her in his best suit with his federal marshal's badge gleaming on his vest. Clara had served as flower girl, scattering petals with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred duty. When Hawkins asked who gave the bride away, Clara had stepped forward without prompting and said, "My daddy would have wanted Mr. Eli to take good care of us, so I'm giving my mama to him with Daddy's blessing." There hadn't been a dry eye in the house. The business with Donovan had been resolved more cleanly than anyone had dared hope. The outlaw leader's organization collapsed with his capture, and the stolen property recovered from their various hideouts was returned to grateful owners throughout Colorado and Wyoming. Eli's patient investigation had provided the federal prosecutors with enough evidence to ensure that Donovan and his surviving followers would spend the rest of their lives in territorial prison. The reward money for Donovan's capture, $2,000, should have been enough to satisfy Harold Morrison's bank and leave Margaret with a substantial nest egg for the ranch's future. Eli's salary as a federal marshal, combined with the ranch's improving cattle operation, promised prosperity that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days before the final battle. But the real treasure, Margaret reflected as she watched her new husband teach her daughter the finer points of horsemanship, was the family they'd built from the ashes of loss and the bonds of shared courage. "Mama, look, Thunder's letting me lead him around the corral." Margaret smiled and waved, remembering the morning when Eli first appeared at their Gatia-scarred stranger, asking for work and finding a home instead. The man who'd jumped into a rushing creek to save a child he didn't know had become the father Clara had dreamed of, and the partner Margaret had never dared hope for. The afternoon mail brought a letter that made Margaret smile even wider. The territorial governor had written personally to commend Eli's service and to inform him that he was being promoted to Chief Federal Marshal for the Colorado Territory, with headquarters to be established in Denver, but with authority to maintain his primary residence wherever duty and family needs dictated. "Good news?" Eli asked, reading her expression as he came in from the corral. "The best kind. Governor wants to make you the Chief Marshal for the whole territory." Eli took the letter and read it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "That's quite an honor and quite a responsibility. Are you going to accept?" "That depends. How do you feel about being married to the most hunted man in Colorado?" Margaret laughed, the sound bright and free. "I think I can handle it. After all, I've got experience dealing with dangerous men." "Is that what I am? Dangerous?" "Absolutely. You're dangerous to my peace of mind, dangerous to my plans for staying independent, and extremely dangerous to my ability to resist your charms." Eli pulled her into his arms, and Margaret marveled at how perfectly she fit against his chest, how naturally his heartbeat synchronized with hers. "Well, when you put it like that, I suppose I should accept the promotion. Someone needs to keep an eye on me." That evening, as the three of them sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and purple, Clara curled up between her parents with her wooden horse in her lap. "Tell me the story again," she requested, as had become their evening tradition, "about how Mama and Mr. Eli fell in love." "Well," Margaret began, settling into the familiar rhythm of the tale, "it started with a little girl who fell into a creek and a stranger who jumped in without thinking twice." "Because heroes don't think about danger when someone needs help," Clara added, reciting her favorite part. "That's right. And sometimes when two people share something important like protecting what matters most, they discover they make a good team. And then they fall in love and get married and live happily ever after." Eli's arm tightened around Margaret's shoulders. "And then they work every day to build something beautiful together, knowing that happily ever after isn't a destination, it's a journey they take side by side." Clara considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned that life contained both joy and sorrow, danger and safety, endings and beginnings. "I think Daddy would be happy that we found each other." "I think so too, sweetheart," Margaret agreed, touching the new wedding ring that now accompanied her mother's cameo and Henry's original band. The three rings told the story of her life-past love, honored, present love celebrated, and future love promised. As the Colorado night settled over the ranch with its familiar sounds, Margaret reflected on the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. A woman who'd thought her capacity for love had died with her first husband had discovered that the heart could expand to hold both memory and hope. A man who'd believed himself unworthy of family had found redemption in protecting those who needed protection. And a little girl who'd lost her father too young had gained a stepfather who understood that some bonds were forged not in blood, but in the courage to choose love over fear, hope over despair, and family over solitude. The wooden horse in Clara's lap caught the last rays of sunlight, its polished surface glowing like a promise that some gifts, once given, would last forever.